Hello everyone, Ben Woodruff here with another falconry video. Today's video is going to be about coping the beak of a bird. Coping is when a beak gets overgrown and we have to trim and sharpen it. And this is a pretty important topic. It's simple, but I've had a lot of people ask me to do a video on this. And because of that, I've hesitated to do so because I think this is a process that is best shown in person with someone with experience. But enough people have asked, and I think it's a valuable enough skill that I want to show the basics. I am going to actually demonstrate it, but I'm going to do two things. I'm going to show how it's done on a whiteboard so we can isolate areas and show really what is the direction you're tackling to remove material. And then I'm going to actually show it on an actual bird. Now, the process I'm going to show is the basics, just the bare minimum for maintenance. Now, there are other issues that can happen if a bird is neglected, or even a bird from the wild. Maybe something happens, it's split, maybe a beak cracks. I'm not showing that. I'm not showing medical treatment. Maybe I will if something comes up, like maybe I'll do that with a rehab bird that comes in somewhere or something, but this is just the basic maintenance of how to trim a beak, how to cope a beak. Now, talons need to be coped as well. I'm going to do that on a separate video because for me it's a very separate subject. But to get started with this, that you got to think about, you might say, why do you need to trim a beak? Because do wild birds have that happen? Do wild birds like, oh no, my beak has gotten too big. Somebody quick, rescue me and trim it. Well, here's how this works. You have to understand the beak a little better to understand what's really going on. So first, think about the skull, okay? Because remember, a lot of people think of a beak as some appendage, but it's not. That's like saying your mouth is something that's put on. It's like, no, your beak is part of your skull. So let's take a look at the skull here. The skull of a bird contains the bony core of the beak. The whole thing is bone, of course, right? The whole skull is bone, including this under beak. But then, over this calcium is a keratin sheath. Keratin is a biological chemical, a molecule that is same thing as your fingernail, okay? Your fingernails are keratin, so is beak. And just like a beak, this grows. So the front part of the beak is all covered with this keratin sheath. And so is the lower mandible, the front of the lower mandible. And just like your fingernail, it grows like a conveyor belt. If you think about the tip of your fingernail is dead. You can clip it, you can trim it, you can whatever. But the base, where it's growing from, you can't damage that. That's alive. It's very sensitive. And if you damage it, cut it, nick it, it will affect the growth of your entire fingernail. It's the same thing with the beak. So that's important to understand, is that a beak is growing their whole life. And it's growing over a living skeletal beak underneath. And it's also growing from the base, which is alive and is actually adding those layers down. So one of the nice things about that is if you do have a nick or a little crack, if you watch it, it will eventually go down and disappear if you treat it right. Now, another thing to give you a little heads up, a lot of overgrowth can be solved just by water. It's surprising. Sometimes first-year birds don't bathe a lot, and they should. And then usually once they, especially like with red tails, I don't know why, I see a lot of red tails that are hesitant to bathe, and then they do it as adults, kind of like some people, right? But water, when they sit in their bath dish, they're getting a drink, and their feet are soaking in the water, their beak is getting wet. If that tip is getting overgrown and you're having, micro, tiny little cracks, then the water seeps in and it can slough off in sheaths. So there is some of that can happen on its own, but overgrowth still does happen. Now, why don't we see it much in the wild, though? I have seen it, but it's rare to have a bird with a truly overgrown beak in the wild. And the reason is there's a couple things. Diet and exercise, or activity level maybe would be a better way to put it. Wild birds, even more sedentary species like bootios, like a red tail that are arm-shitting looking around for a mouse to pounce on. That may not seem very active, but still, they're cruising, they're moving, they're flying a lot more than no matter how much you fly your bird, you're not going to fly it. It's not going to give as much wing time as a wild bird. So they are burning through calories much more quickly. They are more active. And what are they eating? Most birds are, not all, but a lot of birds are eating comparative trash. like especially rodents. Rodents go right through a bird's system. That's why they're eating nonstop. There's another mouse. There's a gopher. There's a prairie dog. Whoa, there's a ground squirrel. And it's like, and they're never fat. Like you will find a robust bird. You might, if you're a bander or a falcon or you trap a hawk, their musculature is full, but they're not like, oh, I couldn't eat another squirrel. I mean, they're never fat. They're robust, but not fat, because they're lean, mean killing machines. They're on the move. And so how keratin works, it's the same thing with people, is the richer your diet and the less active you are, the greater the keratin growth is. So you often see that like if you like I had was in a car accident a few years ago, and just having sitting around during recovery, it's like, oh my gosh, like you have to trim your nails every other day because I was so inactive and I was eating too richly. But it's true with the natural kingdom as well. So that keratin growth usually happens to a more balanced level. And then you have to add to that feeking. At the end of a meal, most raptors will feek, which is where they take their beak and they go like this and they rub it on the perch. And that cleans off any organic particulates that might harbor bacteria on their beak. I mean, obviously they're not thinking that. They're not like, oh, cleanliness is next to godliness, better clean off my beak. It's just instinctive. But that's a side benefit. Cleaning off their beak, safer, but it also sharpens it. It helps wear down at those angles. And it's not just raptors. Many other birds do it too. I raise macaws, and they always do that at the end of every meal. They're like, all right, got to sharpen down this giant beak. And that keeps it from overgrowing and also files it to a point. It's very important with raptors that their beak is sharp. And the reason for that is if you are biting your food, that's your knife, fork, and spoon. Your beak, your talons hold it down, and you're pulling off pieces. You need a beak that is sharp and not overgrown so that you can properly tear apart your dinner. So it's actually needed. It's important. But so again, from feking, a less rich diet, a more active life that burns through the calories they do consume, lead to wild raptors typically not having an overgrown beak. It does still happen, but it's much more rare. Now, in captivity, falconry birds at a zoo, birds in an aviary, rehabilitation birds that are in long-term care, education birds, all of these scenarios, you're having a bird that is more sedentary compared to a wild bird, and you're having a bird that is getting a much richer diet. And I give red tail as an example. I will have, I caught a red tail years ago that when I first trapped it, it was eating rodents, obviously. It's a first-year red tail. And I was feeding it 160 grams of quail the first week. It was just burning through everything. Its metabolism was flipped out. And then, after a week, its body's like, oh my gosh, I'm okay. This is rich food. Okay, I don't have to burn so quickly. This is all right. And the metabolism slowed down to where it was only needing 40 to 50 grams of quail a day. That's a huge drop in caloric need and caloric demand. So because of that, that's a perfect example of hey, here's a bird that had a switch. And so now it's like, oh, okay. Now the really nice thing about that is it's easier to monitor weight management, to get rid of fat, build muscle, and have them predictable instead of being like, I have to eat all the time. It's like, no. We'll fly at the same time every day. We'll have a good, rich meal, and you're good. You're safe. You're set. You don't have to worry about your metabolism flipping out. But again, that bird started to get a longer beak. Now, the biggie is, of course, the summer. Falconry is typically a fall and winter sport. Fall, winter, early spring, and then in the summertime, they molt. They grow new feathers. So most falconers put their birds up for the molt, meaning it's like, all right, I'm not flying you. Here's a bath pan. Here's your flight pen. You go ahead, do your thing. I'm going to stuff you silly. I'm just going to give you as much food as you happen to like so that you will molt properly and as quickly as possible. And then come September, we'll start exercising you, cutting your weight, and go hunt again. But then at that time, you're like, oh, geez, look. All along those feathers have grown in, but so is the beak. Now the beak and the talons are overgrown. Time to cope. So that's usually the time we see it happening, is right before the hunting season. But you might have to do it at other times as well. So that beak, you got to remember, The tip is not alive. Okay, they feel nothing. Now, if you cope the beak, they feel the vibrations, but it doesn't hurt. But eventually, if you go too far, you could hit where it's living tissue and where there is blood. That's why I'm making this video in part to try to give you some help on that. What I want to do is take a look first now at the principle of how we're going to go about doing this. But first, I want to tell you what tools I use. Personally, I use a Dremel. It's a rotary tool. You don't have to use a Dremel brand, but I do. There's battery-operated ones. There's ones that plug into the wall. It's a good system. And then I only use two actual rotary tool pieces. I use the barrel sanding tool, where it's just like a little mini barrel with basically sandpaper around it. I use that for some of the bigger sections. And then I also use a grinding rod, which is just a little tool that is really meant for sharpening knives. It's meant for grinding metal, and it does not take off and remove material as quickly as the sander, which is good for other sections. So I'll show you where I use both of these tools, but a Dremel works well. If you're using files, that's fine. I still recommend the same approach. And the approach I take, I've never known any different. I had not a sponsor, but a veterinarian friend of mine who works extensively with birds. He showed me this technique firsthand. I adopted it, and I've been using it my whole falconry career, and it works. So I know there's other ways, I'm sure, but this is the way I was taught, and this is what I use. So first, let's go back to looking at that skull. Okay, if the skull has now overgrown, so you have more keratin deposition, that tip is much longer, then we need to first shorten it. And so the way to go about doing that is predetermine how short you're going to have it be. And then take the Dremel and just so you have a flat beak now. Now, I don't see most people doing this. Most people will, file, Dremel, file, reduce. The reason I was taught this way, this veterinarian friend of mine said, if you have a mark, hey, this is how short it's supposed to be. We're never going to go any shorter than that. Now let's meet with that point that we lopped off or dremeled down to. So it's actually a good, safe way to make sure you don't take off too much material. So after you have that first section off that you've done with the Dremel, I have to say though, how do you know where that point is? If you've been doing it for years, you know from experience. But if this is your first bird, what do? It's good to always have pictures of your bird when you first get it, so that you can have a reference of what the beak should look like. Because otherwise, you acclimate. The beak grows over time to where you don't realize it's overgrown, and your friends are like, that's ridiculously overgrown. It is? Oh. So it's good to have those references, or have another experienced falconer. And if you absolutely have to, you can just go online and look up photos of the same species to try to get some references. But it's best if you have photo references of your own bird when the beak was the proper length. So anyways, after you have that first section lopped, then we're going to come in from the back. And I'm going to just show this with drawing a circle that you go in with the rotary tool. And this is using that grinder tool rather than the sander tool. And again, in a minute, we're going to see all these demonstrated on a live bird. Once you get to that point and you take off that material, then all you have left to do is just fine tune the tip to get it sharp, and you just tackle it from different angles back again, typically with the sanding tool. So sander to take off the first point, grinder to come in from behind, and then back to the sander tool to make a nice sharp point. So those are basically the 3 steps. Now, before I show you this on a live bird, this is what I do on falcons, on hawks, and on eagles. But this is not what I do with owls. The deposition of keratin is a bit different on owls. So if a beak is getting overgrown on an owl, usually I only do the 3rd step that I showed of these three steps. I usually just take the sander, the rotary sander, and you just reduce the point back, and that's all you do, because the skull is different and the deposition is different. They're actually surprisingly different birds from the other raptors. So that's, maybe you have a different experience, but that's what I do. So let's take a look at now actually doing this on a living bird. I'm going to show you on a Harris hawk of mine named Maddie. She's 21 or 22 years old. She's an old gal. She knows what she's doing. And normally, when I'm coping a bird, I will wrap them in a towel and I will put a hood on them, have somebody hold them, and I do the coping. But Maddie is so used to this because we've been around together for so long. Like normally, if it's just getting a little too long, then I'll just have her standing there and I'll just walk up to her perching and I'll just gently grab her face and bzz, 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 and she's like, okay. I don't even have to hold her. So for this, we're not using a towel or a hood, but normally you would on a bird because most birds are less forgiving. I'm like, what are you doing? So the first step, again, we're going to come in here and just take that rotary sander, reduce the material to a predetermined spot that I have selected as the shortest we should go. And once that process has been done, then come in from behind with that rotary grinder. This one takes a little more skill and a little more experience, not to do it, but to understand what you're doing, to understand, oh, you're meeting back up from the front. Very important step, but once that is done, then again, back to the rotary tool and just to shaping that point down, which does not take all that long. Now, watching this process, you got to understand, with files, it takes longer. Some people prefer files. It's traditional, and it's a bit more precision in some ways. My opinion is, first of all, I was taught this way, so it's just what I know. But more importantly, the less you can stress out a bird, the better, in my opinion, in any circumstance. If you have two options, and this one is going to have less stress, I usually go with that, and that's with this case. If I can, in 2 minutes or less, 1 minute, get the job done, that's way better than taking 5-10 minutes of filing. But that's just my opinion. Not ripping on filing, I'm just saying I prefer the Dremel, and you can see it worked pretty slick, and she's ready to go. So, again, this is just the basics. I hope it was straightforward enough using the whiteboard and showing it actually being done in practice. This is a kind of a tricky thing to show because you got hands in there and Dremels kind of blocking the camera angle. So we did the best we could to kind of show you this process. I will have another video demonstrating what to do with talons, but it is a separate subject. So, but if you have any questions about this process, let me know down below. And again, remember that for the bird, they don't feel any pain. It's not like going to the dentist. It's just having a fingernail on your face, basically. So they feel the vibrations, but there's no harm or actual legitimate distress to the bird. Let me know down in the comments also if there's any other videos you would like to see up and coming in the coming weeks and months. And if you haven't already, please hit subscribe. It really does help me build this channel. I'm trying to get good information out to help falconers. And as always, happy hawking.